By first light in 1910, somewhere on the edge of farmland outside a cluster of homesteads in central Vermont, a father walked out into snow that still held the blue silence of deep winter and found his daughter's shawl laid warm on unbroken ice. The tin lamp she carried was gone. The milk pail was gone. Elsie Rowan was gone. But the shawl sat folded neat across the creek ice, as if a hand had pressed it there and let it go with care. No boot prints led to it. No boot prints led away. The ice showed nothing but wind ripples frozen smooth, and the snow along both banks held no mark heavier than sparrow tracks. The creek ran narrow between two parcels of working land, the Rowan place on the south bank, the Whitcomb farm a quarter-mile north through birch and hemlock that grew thick enough to block sunrise until well past 6. Elsie had crossed that frozen creek 100 times through January and February, carrying milk or eggs or borrowed tools in the morning dark. The route was so familiar she could walk it without thinking, even when the lamp flame jumped and threw wild shadows against tree trunks. Her father, Amos Rowan, had walked the ice himself the afternoon before she disappeared, testing it with his full weight, walking heel to toe across the entire width. It was thick as a man's wrist, hard as window glass, solid enough to trust with a daughter's life. He trusted it. Elsie trusted it. By dawn on the 17th of March, that trust was the last clear thing anyone could say about what happened. Elsie was 16 that winter, steady girl, quiet in church, careful with chores, the kind who rose before her parents and had the kitchen fire stoked without being asked. She kept her hair braided tight and her sleeves rolled when she worked, and she never complained about cold or early hours. She went to the one-room school when roads allowed, sitting near the stove with the younger children, helping them sound out words from McGuffey readers while the teacher worked with older students on arithmetic. She read by lamplight most nights, novels her mother borrowed from the minister's wife, almanacs her father kept on the parlor shelf, old newspapers he brought back from town. People in Vermont still remember her that way. Sensible, unafraid of early mornings, good with younger children, the kind of girl a neighbor would trust to walk through snow and cold with a full pail and come back safe before breakfast. The plan that morning was simple. The Whitcombs had a butter churn Elsie's mother needed for the week's work, and Elsie had offered to fetch it on her way to help Mrs. Whitcomb with bread. The two families traded labor that way all winter. Elsie's mother had strong hands for wringing laundry, Mrs. Whitcomb had skill with yeast dough that never failed, and both houses needed what the other could spare. Elsie woke before her parents, dressed warm in her wool dress and heavy stockings, wrapped herself in the gray wool shawl her grandmother had made 3 winters before, and took the tin lamp from the kitchen hook. The lamp burned clear oil and had a tin shield to block wind from the flame. Amos heard the door latch lift just after 4:30. He heard his daughter's boots on the porch boards, then on the frozen path that led toward the creek. Then he heard nothing else, and he rolled over in the dark and slept another hour, certain she'd be sitting in the Whitcomb kitchen by the time the sun touched the trees, her hands wrapped around hot tea, her shawl hung on the peg by the door. She wasn't. By 6 o'clock, when Mrs. Whitcomb came to the Rowan door asking if Elsie had changed her mind about helping, both families knew something had cracked open in the morning that couldn't be closed again. Amos pulled on his coat and boots and walked fast to the creek, his breath fogging hard in air that still bit cold despite the calendar saying spring was near. The ice was still solid. He could see that from 20 feet away. The snow on both sides was trackless except where he himself had crossed the day before to check a fence post on the Whitcomb side. And there, 20 feet from the south bank, perfectly centered in the width of the creek, lay Elsie's shawl. He knelt beside it. The wool was warm, not cold like fabric left outside for hours in air that froze spit before it hit the ground. Warm, as if it had just come off living shoulders. He picked it up carefully, half expecting to find his daughter underneath, somehow flat against the ice, but there was nothing beneath it except smooth frozen surface. No crack, no fault, no dark place where water might have moved underneath or refrozen in a different texture. He turned in every direction, looking for boot marks, drag marks, anything that would tell him his daughter had stumbled or veered off course or been pulled sideways by something he couldn't see. There was nothing. The snow along the south bank was smooth except for his own tracks from yesterday. The snow along the north bank was smooth except for the deer path that ran parallel to the fence line. The ice between was glass, and the shawl, folded once, lengthwise, like someone had taken time to arrange it with respect, still held faint warmth against his hands when he pressed it to his chest. Amos shouted her name. The sound carried hard across frozen ground, bouncing off birch trunks and the low roof of the Whitcomb barn and echoing back from the ridge behind the property. No answer came. No movement in the woods. No flash of color that might be her dress or her hair. He crossed the rest of the creek to the far side, walking carefully even though he knew the ice would hold, and searched the hemlock edge, calling again and again. Mr. Whitcomb joined him, carrying an axe and a coil of rope in case the girl had fallen through ice somewhere upstream. Together they walked a slow circle around the crossing point, looking for signs in brush, in snowdrifts, along the fence line that marked the property boundary. They found nothing. By mid-morning, 6 men from neighboring farms were walking shoulder to shoulder through the woods, marking fence posts with torn strips of cloth so no one would search the same ground twice. By noon, the minister had arrived with 2 deacons from the church, and they began organizing the search into grid patterns, assigning sections, making sure every stretch of creek and every stand of trees got covered before dark. The tin lamp never turned up. Not that day, not the next. Men walked the creek upstream and downstream for half a mile in each direction, checking under fallen logs, under ice shelves where the bank overhung the water, in hollow stumps and shallow pools that hadn't frozen all the way through. They found nothing. But the shawl sat on the Rowan kitchen table for 2 days, and every person who touched it swore the same thing. It was warmer than it should be. Not hot, not smoking, just wrong. Like it had been lying against skin minutes before, not hours. Like whatever had lifted it off Elsie's shoulders had only just let it go. On the 3rd day, a single boot print appeared in fresh snow 30 yards uphill from the creek, near a stand of young pine the searchers had already walked through twice. The print pointed south, back toward the Rowan house. It was Elsie's size, small, narrow, the kind her mother recognized from years of patching the same boots when the soles wore through. But it stopped mid-stride. No second print followed, no trace of where she might have come from or gone to, just one clear mark in soft snow, as if she had stepped down once from empty air and then lifted away again without bending her knee or shifting her weight. 3 men stood around it for 20 minutes, trying to make sense of the physics, trying to imagine how a girl could leave one print and nothing else. None of them could. By evening, they had roped off the area and told people to stay clear, not because they thought it was evidence of crime, but because they didn't know what else to do with something that shouldn't exist. That same week, a torn scrap of paper appeared in a crack along the fence that divided the Rowan pasture from the woods. It was folded tight and wedged deep, the kind of hiding place a child might use for a secret note passed between friends at school. Amos found it on the 5th morning when he was walking the fence line one more time, desperate for anything his eyes might have missed, any sign that would let him believe his daughter was still alive and simply lost instead of taken by something worse. He pulled the paper out slow and opened it with hands that shook. The handwriting was Elsie's. He knew it the way a man knows his own daughter's hand. The careful school script she practiced in margins, the way she looped her capital I, the slight backward slant she had when she wrote in pencil instead of ink. The note said, "I'm still here. Nothing more. No explanation. No plea for help." Just those 3 words in soft pencil on a scrap torn from a ledger page, the kind her father used to track farm expenses. Amos showed it to his wife, who sat down hard in a kitchen chair and wouldn't speak for an hour. He showed it to the minister, who read it twice and handed it back without comment. He showed it to the men who had been searching since dawn on the 17th, and most of them went quiet. A few suggested someone was playing cruel, that a stranger or a disturbed mind had copied Elsie's writing to wound the family. But her mother touched the paper and said no. She said that was Elsie's hand, Elsie's pressure on the pencil, the exact way she formed her letters when she was writing something true and didn't want to waste words. After that, the searches grew careful in a new way. Men started working in pairs, never alone. They carried whistles and checked in with each other every few minutes, calling out so the other would know they were still there, still solid, still walking the same ground they'd walked the minute before. Mothers began walking their children the long way around to school, even though it added a mile to the trip and made the younger ones cry from cold and exhaustion. The shortcut across the Rowan property, across the creek ice, across the hemlock edge, nobody used it anymore. People in Vermont still don't. Old men in those townships will tell you now what they were told as boys. You don't cross that creek alone before the sun is full up. You don't answer if you hear your name called from the far side of the ice. And you don't go looking for warm things in cold places, because sometimes what you find doesn't want to be found. It wants to be followed. The timeline started making less sense the more people tried to pin it down. Amos Rowan heard the door latch at 4:30, maybe 4:35. He wasn't watching a clock, but it was still full dark, the kind of dark that sits heavy before dawn even thinks about breaking. Elsie would have reached the creek in 5 minutes, maybe 6 if the snow slowed her. The ice crossing took less than a minute. That put her on the far side by 4:40 at the latest, and the Whitcomb house was a straight walk of another 8 or 10 minutes through hemlock and across the cleared yard. Mrs. Whitcomb was already awake, kneading dough in her kitchen, when she heard something outside around 4:50. She told the searchers it sounded like boots on frozen ground, deliberate and steady, coming from the direction of the woods. She assumed it was Elsie and turned to put the kettle on. But no knock came. No door opened. When she stepped onto the porch a few minutes later, the yard was empty. No lamp glow, no movement, just pre-dawn stillness and a faint wind moving through pine branches. By 5:15, Mrs. Whitcomb went back inside, confused but not yet worried. By 5:45, when the sky began to lighten and still no one had arrived, she bundled herself in a coat and walked to the Rowan place. That walk took her 12 minutes. She knocked, asked for Elsie, and watched Amos Rowan's face go blank and hard in the space of a single breath. The problem was simple. If Elsie left at 4:30 and the walk took 15 minutes total, she should have been sitting in the Whitcomb kitchen by 4:45. Mrs. Whitcomb heard boots at 4:50. That left 5 minutes unaccounted for. 5 minutes when Elsie should have already been inside, warming her hands, unwrapping her shawl. But she wasn't. And if the boots Mrs. Whitcomb heard at 4:50 weren't Elsie's, then whose were they? And why did they stop before reaching the door? The searchers asked if anyone else had been out that morning. No one had. The nearest neighbor beyond the Whitcombs was half a mile farther north, an older man named Pruitt who never rose before 6 and hadn't left his property in a week because of a bad knee. The Rowans had no hired men. The Whitcombs had no guests. The only people awake in that stretch of Vermont farmland before 5 in the morning were Amos, his wife, Mrs. Whitcomb, and Elsie. And Elsie never made it across. By mid-morning on the first day, 8 men were walking the woods in pairs, calling her name, checking ravines and dense brush where a girl might have wandered off path and fallen. They brought 2 dogs from a farm 3 miles east. Good tracking dogs used for finding lost cattle and raccoons in summer. The dogs picked up Elsie's scent at the Rowan house, followed it down the path toward the creek, and stopped dead at the south bank. Both animals sat down hard in the snow, whining low in their throats, and refused to go farther. The handler pulled them forward by their leads, dragging them onto the ice. One dog twisted and fought to get back to shore. The other lay flat and went silent, staring at the spot where the shawl had been found and wouldn't move even when the handler knelt and tried to coax it up with bits of dried meat. "They won't cross," the handler said, looking at the men standing around him. "I've had these dogs 8 years. They've never done this." One of the deacons suggested the ice might be cracked somewhere underneath, that the dogs could sense instability humans couldn't see. But Amos and 3 others walked the full width of the creek again, jumping hard in places, testing for weakness. The ice didn't crack. It didn't even creak. It was solid all the way across, thick and clear. The kind of ice that could hold a wagon if someone were foolish enough to try it. They searched the far side anyway, working through the hemlock stand in a line, each man an arm's length from the next, eyes on the ground. They tied strips of torn cloth to branches and fence posts as they went, marking their progress so they'd know what ground they'd covered. By noon, they'd walked a square half-mile around the Whitcomb house and found nothing. No footprints, no fabric caught on thorns, no sign that Elsie had ever reached the far side of the creek. On the second day, more men arrived. Farmers from surrounding townships, men who didn't know the Rowans well but knew what it meant when a girl disappeared in winter. They brought lanterns, coils of rope, grappling hooks for dragging the creek in places where the ice had thinned near the banks. They broke through the ice upstream and downstream, checking for a body caught underneath, pulled along by current. They found nothing. The water was shallow, clear, slow-moving. There was nowhere for a body to hide. On the third day, they found the single boot print uphill from the creek. That was when the mood changed. Men who had been working fast and loud began working slow and quiet. Conversations dropped to murmurs. No one wanted to say out loud what they were all thinking. That a girl couldn't leave one print in soft snow and nothing else unless something had happened that didn't follow the rules of how ground and snow and walking worked. That night, one of the younger men, a farmhand named Cutler who worked for a family 2 miles west, was walking the fence line alone with a lantern, checking the posts one more time before heading home. He heard a sound behind him, a low scrape, like boot leather on frozen ground. He turned fast, holding the lantern high. No one was there. He called out, thinking maybe one of the other searchers had come up quiet. No answer. He walked back along the fence, sweeping the lantern side to side, looking for movement. The scraping sound came again, this time from his right, near a stand of young birch. He walked toward it. The sound stopped. He stood in the snow, breathing hard, listening. For a long moment there was nothing. Then he heard it a third time. Behind him again. Back where he'd started. As if something were circling him just outside the light. Cutler didn't run, but he walked fast back to where the other men were gathered near the Rowan barn. He told them what he'd heard. A few of them went back with him, carrying their own lanterns, and they walked the fence line together. They found nothing. No tracks. No movement. But when they stood still and listened, 2 of them swore they heard it too. A faint scraping, rhythmic and deliberate, moving through the trees parallel to where they stood. Could be a deer, one of them said, but his voice didn't carry conviction. Deer don't walk like that, another answered. They tied a cloth strip to the post nearest where they'd heard the sound, and they agreed not to walk that section alone anymore. By the 4th day, that agreement had spread to the whole search. No one went into the woods solo. No one checked the creek banks without a partner. The older men, the ones who had lived in Vermont long enough to know that some winters held things besides cold, started telling the younger ones to work in pairs, to call out every few minutes, to keep their voices steady so the others would know they were still themselves. On the 5th day, a cloth strip that had been tied to a fence post near the hemlock stand disappeared. 3 men swore they had seen it that morning, a bright red rag knotted tight around weathered wood. By afternoon it was gone. In its place, tied to a post 10 yards farther into the trees, was a strip of gray fabric no one recognized. It wasn't torn cloth from a shirt or a feed sack. It was wool, finely woven, the kind used for winter shawls. One of the deacons untied it carefully and brought it back to the Rowan house. Elsie's mother looked at it for a long time, then nodded once. "That's from the same bolt as her shawl," she said. "My mother bought 2 lengths. One for Elsie. One she kept for herself, but she passed before she ever used it." The fabric had been stored in a trunk in the Rowan attic for 3 years. No one had touched it. No one had taken it out. And yet there it was, tied to a fence post deep in the woods, in a place Elsie had never been. The men stopped talking after that. They kept searching, but the pace slowed. Some of them started glancing over their shoulders. Others began finishing their sections early and heading home before the light dropped. The minister held a prayer vigil on the 6th night, and nearly 40 people came, filling the small church until there was standing room only. They prayed for Elsie's safe return. They prayed for clarity. They prayed, though most of them didn't say it out loud, for protection from whatever had taken her. On the 7th day, just after dawn, a man named Harlan, who lived a mile south of the Rowans, was walking his own property line when he saw a light moving through the trees near the creek. It was faint, flickering, the kind of light a tin lamp with an oil flame would throw. He called out, thinking maybe one of the searchers had started early. The light stopped moving. Then it went out. Harlan walked toward the spot. his boots crunching loud in frozen snow. When he reached the place where the light had been, he found nothing. No lamp, no person, no warmth in the air. But the snow where he stood had been disturbed, not by boots, but by something smooth and wide, as if a heavy sled had been dragged across it. The marks led toward the creek and stopped at the bank. They didn't continue onto the ice. They just ended, clean and absolute, as if whatever had made them had lifted straight up into the air. Harlan told the others what he'd seen. That afternoon, 3 men went back to the spot with him and stood looking at the marks. One of them knelt and touched the snow. It was packed hard, compressed under weight, but there were no edges, no clear lines that would say what kind of object had made it. They followed the drag marks backward toward the woods, but the trail faded after 20 feet, dissolving into ordinary snow that showed no sign of disturbance. By the 8th day, people in Vermont had started changing their routines. Mothers walked children to school in groups. Families began locking doors at night, something many of them had never done before. Men working alone on their own land started carrying whistles, the kind used to signal across long distances. And no one, not the young, not the old, not the brave or the foolish, walked near the creek before the sun was fully up. The old hands, the ones who remembered other winters and other disappearances that didn't sit right, told the younger ones what they knew. You don't go looking for lights in the woods before dawn. You don't follow sounds that circle you. And you don't touch things that feel warm when everything around them is frozen cold. By the 2nd week, the search had stopped being about finding Elsie and started being about not losing anyone else. The men still walked the woods, still tied cloth strips to mark their progress, still called her name into the cold, but their voices had changed. They were quieter now, more careful, and they watched each other as much as they watched the ground. The minister organized the effort into strict grid patterns, assigning pairs to specific sections, keeping a written log of who went where and when they returned. No one argued with the system. No one wanted to be the next person who walked into the trees and didn't walk back out. Elsie's father stopped sleeping. He spent his nights sitting at the kitchen table with the note she'd left, "I'm still here," pressed flat under his palm, reading those 3 words over and over as if repetition might unlock some meaning he'd missed. Her mother kept the shawl folded in a drawer, wrapped in clean linen, because she couldn't stand to look at it anymore, but couldn't bear to let it go. The warmth had faded from the wool after the first 2 days, but the memory of it hadn't. Every person who had touched that shawl in those early hours carried the wrongness of it with them, a feeling in their hands they couldn't shake. On the 10th day, a second note appeared. This one was found by a boy named Thomas, 11 years old, son of one of the farmers helping with the search. He'd been told to stay near the barn, to keep watch over the younger children while the adults worked, but he'd wandered to the edge of the pasture, where the fence met the tree line. There, wedged into a knothole in a fence post his father had checked 3 times already, was a folded piece of paper. Thomas pulled it out and ran back to the barn, shouting for the adults. The handwriting was Elsie's, same careful loops, same backward slant. The paper was torn from the same kind of ledger her father used. But the words were different this time. It said, "Don't look for me past the hemlock." Amos read it, and his face went white. The minister read it and set it down without speaking. Mrs. Whitcomb read it and started to cry. Not loud, just a quiet, steady weeping that didn't stop for an hour. The men passed it around, each one holding it briefly, each one handing it off as if it burned. No one knew what to do with it. The hemlock stand was where they'd been searching hardest. Dense trees, thick undergrowth, the kind of place a girl could get lost or trapped if she'd wandered off path in the dark. The note seemed to be warning them away from the very place they most needed to look. "Maybe someone's trying to throw us off," one of the younger men said. "Maybe someone took her and they're using her handwriting to make us stop searching the right place." But Elsie's mother shook her head. She studied the paper in the lamplight, tracing the letters with one finger, and when she finally spoke, her voice was flat and distant. "That's her hand. That's how she writes when she's afraid. The letters get tighter. She presses harder. She did that on school tests when she wasn't sure of the answer." "How would someone else know that?" the minister asked quietly. No one answered. They searched the hemlock stand anyway. They had to. But they went in groups of 4 now. Not 2. They carried whistles and checked in every 5 minutes. And they marked their entry and exit times in the minister's log, with the kind of precision men use when they're trying to convince themselves that order and record-keeping can protect them from things that don't follow rules. They found nothing new. No footprints, no fabric, no sign that Elsie had ever been there. But 2 of the men swore they heard something while they were deep in the trees. A low sound, almost like humming, coming from no direction they could fix. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, then stopped. When they called out to each other to confirm what they'd heard, both of them described it the same way. Not quite music, not quite voice, but something in between, and it made the air feel heavier, thicker, harder to pull into their lungs. That night, the minister spoke privately with the older men, the ones who had lived in Vermont through enough hard winters to know that cold and isolation could do strange things to a community. He asked if anyone remembered other disappearances, other stories that didn't sit right. 3 of them did. An old man named Coombs, who'd lived in the area for 60 years, said his grandfather had told him about a girl who went missing near the same creek back in the 1840s. She'd been walking to a neighbor's house before dawn, same as Elsie. They found her bonnet on the ice, still warm. No body, no tracks. The family moved away within a year. Another man, a farmer named Yates, said his uncle had refused to cross that creek alone his entire life. Wouldn't even say why. Just shook his head and took the long way around whenever he needed to go north. And a deacon named Pierce said he'd heard stories as a boy about lights in the woods near the creek, lights that moved wrong, too smooth, too deliberate, like something was carrying them through the trees at a height no human hand could reach. "We don't talk about it much," Pierce said. "Didn't seem Christian to give voice to that kind of fear. But people know. People have always known. You don't cross that creek alone before sunrise. You don't follow sounds you can't explain, and you don't go looking in the hemlock stand when the light's not full." The minister listened to all of this and then asked the question no one else wanted to ask. "Do you think someone took her, or do you think something did?" The men were quiet for a long time. Finally, Coombs spoke. "I think something's been out there longer than we have. I think it knows the routines. Knows when people walk alone. Knows the in-between times, the dark hours when folks are careless because they're tired or in a hurry. And I think it takes what it can reach." "That's not a Christian answer," the minister said, but his voice was uncertain. "No," Coombs agreed. "It's not." On the 12th day, Elsie's shawl disappeared from the drawer where her mother had stored it. The house had been locked. No one had come inside. Mrs. Rowan found the drawer open that morning, the linen wrapping still folded neat, but the shawl was gone. She searched the entire house, tearing through closets and trunks and cupboards, convinced she'd moved it and forgotten. She hadn't. The shawl was simply gone, as completely as Elsie herself. 2 days later, a farmhand walking the road past the Rowan property saw something gray hanging from a low branch near the creek. He walked closer, thinking maybe it was an animal pelt or a piece of tarp blown loose in the wind. It was Elsie's shawl. He recognized the weave, the exact gray color, the frayed corner where it had caught on a nail years before and never been properly mended. He called for help, and 3 men came running. They stood beneath the branch staring up at the shawl, and no one wanted to be the first to touch it. Finally, Amos climbed up and took it down. The wool was warm again, not as warm as it had been the first time, but warmer than fabric left outside overnight should be. And it was damp, not with snow or rain, but with something else, something that felt thicker, almost oily, that didn't soak into the fibers the way water did. Amos held it away from his body as he climbed down, and when he reached the ground he handed it to the minister without looking at it again. The minister took it back to the church and locked it in the vestry room in a wooden cabinet where the communion silver was kept. He didn't tell anyone where he'd put it. He just said it was somewhere safe, somewhere it couldn't move again on its own. But the next morning when he opened the cabinet to check, the shawl was folded differently than he'd left it. He was sure of that. He'd laid it flat, unfolded, across the bottom of the cabinet. Now it was folded lengthwise, the same way Amos had found it on the ice, as if someone had come in during the night and rearranged it with care. The minister locked the cabinet again and didn't open it for 3 days. By the third week, theories were spreading through the community like fever. Some said Elsie had run away, that she'd been unhappy in ways her parents hadn't seen, that the notes were her way of tormenting them for some imagined cruelty. But no one who knew her believed that. She'd been steady, content, the kind of girl who loved her family and her routines and had no reason to vanish. Others said someone had taken her, a drifter passing through, a man with bad intentions who'd been watching the farms and waiting for a girl to walk alone in the dark. But there were no strangers in the area. The roads were frozen, impassable to wagons. The nearest town was 8 miles south, and the storekeeper there said no one unfamiliar had come through in weeks. A few whispered that the land itself had taken her, that the creek and the hemlock stand and the stretch of woods between the two farms had always been wrong, had always held something that wanted company, and Elsie had simply walked into its reach at the wrong hour. Those people didn't say it loud. They said it in kitchens after dark, in low voices, and they crossed themselves when they were done speaking. Even though crossing yourself against land and wood and water wasn't something the church taught. The searchers kept going out, but the effort was winding down. By the 4th week, only a handful of men were still walking the grid patterns, and they did it more out of duty than hope. Elsie's parents stopped asking for updates. They sat in their house with the windows covered, and they didn't speak much even to each other. People in Vermont had started living differently. Children didn't go outside before dawn, not for chores, not for anything. Mothers walked in groups to the schoolhouse and waited together until every child was inside before heading home. Men working their own land started carrying lanterns even in full daylight, and they kept those lanterns lit, wasting oil, because the light felt safer than the alternative. And no one crossed the creek alone. Not then. Not now. The old men told the young ones, and the young ones listened, because by the end of that march, everyone in those townships understood that some rules didn't come from law or custom. They came from watching what happened when you broke them. The search ended quietly, the way most searches do when there's nothing left to find and no energy left to look. By the end of April, when snow had melted and the creek ran fast with spring melt, a few men walked the banks one final time, checking for anything the thaw might have revealed. They found nothing. Elsie Rowan had been gone 6 weeks, and the consensus, unspoken but absolute, was that she wasn't coming back. The family held a memorial service without a body. 40 people came. The minister spoke about faith and mystery and the limits of human understanding, and when he was finished, no one asked questions because there were no questions left that had answers anyone wanted to hear. Amos and his wife stayed on the farm through that summer, working the land in silence, but by autumn they'd made arrangements to leave. They sold the property to a cousin from the southern part of the state, a man who'd never heard the story and didn't ask many questions about why good farmland was going for half what it should. The cousin moved in with his family that October, and within 3 months he'd moved out again. He never said exactly why. He just told people the place didn't feel right, that his children woke up crying most nights, that his dogs wouldn't go near the creek, and that he'd heard sounds in the woods before dawn that made him keep his family indoors until full daylight. He sold at a loss and left Vermont entirely. The property sat empty for 2 years. Then a logging company bought it, planning to clear the hemlock stand for timber. They sent a crew in the spring of 1913, 6 men with saws and axes and a foreman who didn't believe in local superstition. The crew worked for 3 days, felling trees on the far side of the property, away from the creek. On the 4th morning, one of the men didn't show up for work. The foreman walked to the boarding house where the crew was staying and found the man packing his belongings. "I'm done," the man said. "I heard something last night. Sounded like a girl calling for help coming from the direction of the hemlock. I went to the window and looked out and I saw a light moving through the trees. Not a lantern. Too smooth, too high off the ground. I'm not going back out there." 2 more men quit that afternoon. The foreman shut down the operation and pulled the crew out. The logging company sold the timber rights back to the county for a fraction of what they'd paid, and the hemlock stand was left alone. It's still there now, thicker and darker than it was in 1910, and no logging outfit in Vermont will touch it. The old contracts list it as protected land, but the truth is simpler. No one wants to work there. And no company wants to lose men to a place that's been marked wrong for over a century. The Whitcomb family stayed on their farm longer, but they stopped using the creek crossing entirely. They built a new road that looped east, adding a quarter-mile to any trip south. And they told their children that the old path was unsafe, that the ground was unstable, that the ice in winter couldn't be trusted. By 1920, the Whitcombs had moved to a town 15 miles north, citing age and the difficulty of farm work. But everyone knew the real reason. Mrs. Whitcomb had stopped sleeping. She told the minister in confidence that she heard boots on frozen ground outside her house some mornings, the same deliberate rhythm she'd heard the morning Elsie disappeared, and she couldn't live with that sound anymore. The schoolhouse changed its hours. Before 1910, children were expected to arrive by 7:30, even in winter, even in the dark. After Elsie, the school board moved the start time to 8:30, citing safety and the difficulty of travel in cold months. But the real reason was that no parent in central Vermont would send a child out before sunrise anymore. Not on those roads, not past those woods. The rule held for decades. Even now, schools in that region tend to start later than schools elsewhere in the state. And if you ask why, most people will say it's tradition or weather or something about rural bus routes. But the old families know. They know it started the spring a girl walked out in the dark and never came back. The shawl appeared one more time, years later, in a way that no one could explain and no one wanted to examine too closely. It was the summer of 1925, 15 years after Elsie disappeared. A teacher named Margaret Hale, new to the area, was cleaning out a storage room in the schoolhouse, sorting through old books and supplies left behind by previous teachers. In a wooden crate pushed far back under a shelf, she found a folded gray shawl. It was old, well-made, the kind of wool weaving that wasn't common anymore. She pulled it out, thinking maybe she could wash it and use it herself come winter. The moment she touched it, she felt warmth in the fabric. Not much, just enough to notice. She set it down fast and went to find the schoolhouse caretaker, an older man named Vern who'd lived in the area his whole life. She brought him to the storage room and pointed at the shawl. "Do you know where that came from?" she asked. Vern looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at her. "You don't touch that," he said quietly. "You don't move it. You don't take it out of this building. You leave it right where it is." "Why?" He didn't answer directly. He just said, "Some things belong to the past and they need to stay there. That's one of them." Margaret didn't argue. She'd been in Vermont long enough to recognize the tone men used when they were serious about something they wouldn't explain. She helped Vern put the shawl back in the crate, and they pushed the crate deep under the shelf, farther back than it had been before. She never touched it again. When she left the school 3 years later to take a position in another county, she told the next teacher there was a crate in the storage room that should never be opened. The next teacher told the one after that. The instruction passed down through decades, teacher to teacher, until the schoolhouse finally closed in 1968 and the building was converted to a community center. During the renovation, workers cleared out the storage room. They found the crate. They opened it. The shawl was gone. No one knows where it went. No one saw it leave. It simply wasn't there anymore, and the workers, when asked, said the crate had been full of old papers and nothing else. But a woman who'd attended the school as a child in the 1940s swears she remembers seeing that shawl once, when a teacher sent her to fetch supplies from the storage room. She said it was folded neat on top of the crate, not inside it, and when she got close enough to see it clearly, she felt cold all through her body despite it being May. She ran back to the classroom without the supplies and wouldn't tell the teacher why. She's in her 80s now, living in a town on the other side of Vermont, and she still won't drive past the creek where Elsie disappeared. She takes the long way around, the way her parents taught her, the way everyone in that part of the state learned to do after March 1910. People in Vermont still talk about Elsie Rowan, though the details have softened with time. Some say she ran away to escape a hard life, that the notes were her way of saying goodbye, that she made it to a city somewhere and lived under a new name. Others say she fell through thin ice, despite her father's certainty that the ice was sound, that her body was carried downstream and never recovered, that the shawl and the notes were just coincidence and grief playing tricks on a community already half mad with winter isolation. A few, The ones who've lived longest in those townships say something else. They say the land out past the hemlock takes what it wants, that it's been taking for longer than anyone remembers, and that Elsie wasn't the first and won't be the last. They don't say what the land is or why it wants company or what it does with the people it takes. They just say, you don't cross that creek alone before sunrise. You don't follow lights in the woods. You don't answer when you hear your name called from the trees. And if you find something warm in a cold place, you leave it where it is and you walk away fast. The rules have held. Mothers teach them to children. Old men teach them to young men. Teachers mention them casually to students who've just moved to the area, framing them as weather safety or local custom, never explaining the real reason. And the creek, narrow and shallow and perfectly ordinary in daylight, stays empty in the hours before dawn. No one fishes there early. No one cuts through the old Rowan property to save time. No one walks the hemlock stand alone. The land has been left to itself, and the people who live around it have learned to respect the boundary between what they can explain and what they can't. There are 3 ways to understand what happened to Elsie Rowan. The first is human. Someone took her, hid her, killed her, and used her own handwriting and her family's belongings to cover the crime or drive the family mad with grief. The second is natural. She fell, or drowned, or wandered into the woods in the dark and succumbed to cold and everything else. The warm shawl, the notes, the sounds, the lights, was coincidence and collective panic. The third version is the one nobody in Vermont says out loud, but everyone who's lived there long enough understands. It's the version that explains why the shawl stayed warm on frozen ground, why the notes appeared after she was already gone, why the boot prints walked backward, why dogs wouldn't cross the creek, why lights moved through the hemlock at the wrong height, why the land itself seemed to know her routines, her path, the exact moment she'd be alone and unprotected in the dark. Which version makes sense here? The human one, the natural one, or the impossible one nobody in Vermont dares to say out loud? And what detail in this story should not exist in a normal world, where wool goes cold when you leave it in snow, where girls who disappear don't leave notes after they're gone, and where ground that's been searched 100 times doesn't grow new evidence like it's being planted by something that wants to be remembered? Subscribe so you don't miss the next story.